Welcome to well, this deep dive. It's going to be about the world of Michael Madison.
Yeah,
This isn't just another true crime story, you know.
right.
The time you hear on other podcasts, you wanted more.
Yeah.
You want a real deep dive, and believe me, Madison's case runs deep. It's got everything: a troubled past, brutal crimes, a whole lot of lingering questions. We're talking East Cleveland, Ohio, 2012 to 2013.
Yeah, and as we kind of unpack all this, it's important to remember that understanding the why behind these horrific acts doesn't diminish the impact of what happened.
Exactly. It's not about justifying anything, but maybe by looking closer, we can learn something valuable. So picture this. July 2013, a stench is coming from a garage
Hmm.
rented by none other than Michael Madison. Inside, a gruesome discovery, a decomposing body.
And as if that wasn't chilling enough, the horror was just beginning. Two more bodies turned up nearby, one in a backyard, the other in the basement of a vacant house.
Oh, wow.
Each victim found wrapped in plastic bags.
Yeah, it's the kind of detail that gets under your skin. It's almost too awful to imagine. But before we go any further, we need to remember these are real people, not just case files. Shatisha Sheely, 28 years old, vanished in September 2012. Then there's Angela Deskins, 38. She disappeared June 2013. And lastly, 18-year-old Sherelda Helen Terry, who was last seen leaving her summer job at a Cleveland elementary school in July 2013.
These details really highlight something that often comes up in serial killer cases: the vulnerability of the victims. These individuals were just going about their lives, unaware of the danger that was lurking nearby.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought, realizing how easily someone can just vanish.
Right.
And in this case, it seems Madison preyed on those he thought were less likely to be missed.
Exactly. There's often a pattern of targeting individuals who might not have strong social networks or whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. It's a chilling strategy, really, a way of maximizing the chances of getting away with the crimes.
Now, to understand Madison, we have to go back to his beginnings. The sources you provided paint a bleak picture of his childhood, filled with horrific abuse. And not just from strangers, but from within his own family.
Yes, the details are truly disturbing. From a young age, Madison experienced severe abuse at the hands of his mother, Diane, and a string of her boyfriends.
Wow.
The impact of this kind of prolonged trauma, especially during those crucial developmental years, can be profound.
It's hard to even fathom the kind of psychological scars that leaves behind. He was basically robbed of a safe and nurturing environment, something that's like so fundamental to healthy development. And what I found especially fascinating was that later Madison admitted to having conflicting emotions about his mother's death.
That's a really important point you bring up. I mean, it might seem counterintuitive, right?
Yeah,
But these mixed feelings are actually not uncommon for individuals who have experienced abuse, particularly within a parent-child relationship.
okay.
It's all tied to a complex psychological phenomenon known as ambivalent attachment.
Ambivalent attachment.
You see, even in the face of abuse, there's often a deep-seated need for love and approval from the parent.
So even though the parent is the source of the trauma, there's still this longing for connection.
Absolutely. And when that parent dies, it can trigger a confusing mix of emotions, relief because the abuse has ended, but also grief for the loss of that complex, dysfunctional relationship. And often there's guilt mixed in as well.
Guilt. Why guilt?
Imagine carrying the weight of that abuse, the resentment, maybe even hatred, for years. And then suddenly that person is gone, and those intense feelings might feel unresolved. There's no chance for confrontation, for understanding, for forgiveness. It leaves a void, and that void can be filled with guilt.
It's a powerful reminder that trauma doesn't just disappear. It lingers, even in unexpected ways. It makes you wonder how much of Madison's later actions were shaped by this incredibly difficult childhood.
Right. The question of nature versus nurture always comes into play, especially in extreme cases like this. We know childhood trauma can increase the risk of violent behavior, but it's never a simple cause and effect situation.
Because every individual responds to trauma differently.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Everyone has a different breaking point, a different way of coping with stress and adversity. For some, trauma might manifest as withdrawal or depression. For others, it could lead to substance abuse or self-harm. And in tragically rare cases, like Madison's, it can contribute to a trajectory of violence.
So are you saying that his childhood abuse, terrible as it was, doesn't fully explain his crimes?
Exactly. We have to consider other factors too, like personality traits, genetics, and even social influences. It's a puzzle with many pieces, and understanding Madison requires looking at the whole picture, not just one isolated part.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a mystery, trying to piece together all these different clues to understand what led him down this dark path. And speaking of clues, the police acted swiftly after those horrifying discoveries, didn't they?
They did. I mean, think about it. You have 3 bodies discovered within a short period of time, all bearing similar hallmarks. That immediately signals the possibility of a serial offender, and the pressure is on to apprehend the perpetrator quickly.
Yeah, I can only imagine the sense of urgency surrounding this investigation. Every hour that passed could potentially mean another victim.
Exactly, and thankfully the police wasted no time. Following the discovery of the bodies, they quickly honed in on Michael Madison. A brief standoff took place at his mother's house, but he was eventually taken into custody without further incident. The charges were swift and severe, 3 counts of aggravated murder, and his bail was set at a staggering $6 million.
6 million. Wow, that's an incredibly high amount. It seems like the authorities aren't taking any chances.
Right, it clearly reflects the gravity of the accusations against him. The authorities viewed him as a significant flight risk and a danger to the community. But here's where things get even more interesting. Madison decided to waive his right to a preliminary hearing.
Okay, now I'm really curious. For those of us who aren't legal experts, what exactly does that mean, and why would he choose to do that?
Well, a preliminary hearing is kind of like a mini trial. The prosecution presents some of its evidence, and the judge decides that there's enough to proceed to a full trial. Waiving that hearing could be a strategic move by the defense, maybe to avoid revealing their defense strategy too early, or to expedite the process, perhaps hoping for a plea deal down the line.
So it's a calculated gamble. He's essentially bypassing a step in the process, but for what purpose, we can only speculate, I guess.
Exactly. It adds another layer of intrigue to this already complex case. But as the investigation progressed, the prosecution's case against Madison grew even stronger. They discovered what they termed further evidence of decomposition in his apartment, further solidifying their belief that the murders took place there.
Wow, that must have been a turning point in the case. It paints a chilling picture, knowing that those innocent women met their end in that very apartment. It's hard to reconcile the banality of everyday life with the horrific acts that can occur behind closed doors.
That's a great observation. There's often this stark contrast between the ordinariness of a setting and the extraordinary darkness that can unfold within it. And as the evidence mounted, the prosecution made a momentous decision. They would seek the death penalty.
Wow, the death penalty, it's such a weighty decision, fraught with ethical complexities and deeply ingrained societal beliefs. I imagine that decision wasn't laid lightly.
You're absolutely right. The death penalty is a deeply divisive issue. Some see it as the ultimate form of justice, a fitting retribution for heinous crimes. Others view it as morally reprehensible, arguing that the state should never have the power to take a human life.
It's a debate that goes beyond legal arguments and delves into the very core of our values as a society. What factors do you think prosecutors consider when making such a grave decision?
It's a complex calculus, to be sure. They weigh the brutality of the crime, the impact on the victims' families, the potential for future danger to society, and of course the strength of the evidence. In Madison's case, the heinous nature of the crimes, coupled with the undeniable evidence linking him to the murders, likely tipped the scales in favor of seeking the death penalty.
It's a reminder that these legal decisions have far-reaching consequences, not only for the defendant, but also for the families of the victims and for society as a whole. So, with the death penalty on the table, how did the trial unfold?
Well, imagine the tension in that courtroom as the trial began on April 4, 2016. All eyes were on Michael Madison, the man accused of these horrific acts. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, a common strategy in such high-stakes cases.
I'm guessing the prosecution had a mountain of evidence to present. What were some of the key pieces that helped them build their case?
The physical evidence was critical, of course. They presented the forensic evidence found at the crime scenes in Madison's apartment and on his belongings. But there was another element that played a significant role, his past. Remember his prior conviction for attempted rape.
Right, that was a chilling detail that emerged early on. It seems like a crucial piece of the puzzle, painting a picture of someone with a history of violence against women.
Exactly. The prosecution argued that this prior conviction demonstrated a pattern of escalating criminal behavior, a disturbing trajectory culminating in these horrific murders. And they had a point. You see, research shows that individuals who commit violent crimes often exhibit warning signs earlier in their lives, often in the form of less serious offenses.
So it's like a warning system, but one that's often missed or dismissed until it's too late.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. And in Madison's case, that prior conviction served as a powerful piece of evidence, helping the jury understand the potential danger he posed and the premeditation behind his actions.
Given the weight of the evidence in his prior conviction, I'm guessing the jury didn't take long to reach a verdict.
You're right. After deliberating for less than a day, they returned with a unanimous decision. Guilty on all 13 counts. The charges included 3 counts of aggravated murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, among others.
13 counts. It's a staggering indictment, a stark reflection of the magnitude of his crimes. But even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, did Madison accept the verdict?
Not at all. He immediately announced his intention to appeal the decision to the Ohio Supreme Court, a common legal strategy in death penalty cases. But for the families of the victims, the verdict brought a sense of justice, albeit tinged with the profound sadness of their loss.
I can only imagine the mix of emotions in that courtroom. Relief, grief, anger. It must have been overwhelming for everyone involved.
It was a highly charged atmosphere filled with raw emotion. And in a moment that captured the intensity of the moment, Sherelda Terry's father, Van Terry, lunged at Madison in the courtroom, unable to contain his grief and rage.
Wow, that must have been a powerful and heartbreaking scene. It highlights the ripple effect of these crimes, the deep and lasting trauma inflicted not only on the victims, but also on their loved ones.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that justice, while essential, can never fully heal the wounds left behind by such horrific acts. And then there was Madison's reaction to the verdict.
What was his reaction? I'm almost afraid to ask.
He smirked.
He smirked after being found guilty of such brutal crimes.
Yes, a chilling and unsettling detail that left many observers bewildered and disturbed. It seems to reflect a profound detachment from the gravity of his actions, a lack of remorse that sent chills down the spines of those present in the courtroom. It's like, how can someone, be found guilty of such brutal crimes and just smirk?
Yeah.
It's baffling.
It's chilling. It's almost as if he was trying to maintain a sense of control even as his world was crumbling around him, like a final act of defiance in the face of justice. But even with a guilty verdict, the legal process wasn't over, was it?
No, not at all. The sentencing phase was still to come, and remember, the prosecution was seeking the death penalty.
Right.
On May 20th, 2016, the jury delivered its recommendation, death. And a month later, Judge Nancy McDonnell upheld their decision, formally sentencing Madison to death.
So another layer of complexity added to this already intricate case. What happens next? Is he immediately sent to death row?
Well, not quite. You see, even in cases where the death penalty is imposed, there's a lengthy appeals process. It's a system designed to ensure due process, to minimize the possibility of executing an innocent person.
So even though he's been sentenced to death, there are still legal avenues to explore.
Precisely. These appeals can take years, even decades, to work their way through the courts. And in Madison's case, his execution was stayed pending further appeals.
It's a reminder that the justice system, while striving for fairness and accuracy, is a complex and often lengthy process. But before we delve further into the complexities of the appeals process, there's a shocking twist in this story we haven't discussed yet.
Yeah, a truly unexpected and tragic turn of events. In 2019, 3 years after Madison's conviction, his mother, Diane, was brutally murdered in her own home.
Wait, what? His own mother? You're kidding, right? This is the same Diane who subjected him to years of abuse.
Yes, the very same. It adds a whole new dimension to this already horrific tale. Diane was found stabbed multiple times, and tragically, 3 of her grandchildren were also injured in the attack.
Oh my gosh, this is just awful. Who would do such a thing? Was it a random act of violence?
No, not at all. The perpetrator turned out to be her own grandson, Jalen Plummer, who was subsequently charged with her murder and 3 counts of attempted murder.
Wow. Talked about a shocking twist of fate. It seems violence begets violence, a tragic cycle repeating itself within the same family. It makes you wonder about the long-term effects of exposure to abuse and the possibility of, intergenerational trauma.
It's a crucial point you raise. Jalen Plummer's actions raise profound questions about the lasting impact of witnessing violence, especially within the family. Could his exposure to the abuse inflicted by his grandmother, and perhaps even the horrific acts committed by his uncle, have played a role in his own violent outburst?
It's a question that haunts this entire case. Was Jalen in some way shaped by the violence that surrounded him? Did he internalize that aggression and ultimately act it out in a horrifyingly similar way?
These are questions that psychologists and criminologists grapple with constantly. The impact of childhood trauma is undeniable, but it manifests in different ways for different individuals. For some, it might lead to withdrawal and depression. For others, it might fuel anger and aggression. It's a complex interplay of nature and nurture, individual predisposition, and environmental influences.
So we're back to that puzzle analogy, trying to piece together all these different factors to make sense of an act of violence. And sadly, in this case, the puzzle seems to repeat itself from one generation to the next. What was the outcome of Jalen Plummer's case?
Well, in a tragic echo of his uncle's fate, Jalen pleaded guilty to all charges against him. In June 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years.
Another life shattered by violence, another family left to grapple with the aftermath. It's a sobering reminder that actions have consequences, that the ripple effects of violence can extend far beyond the immediate victims. But let's circle back to Michael Madison. Where does he stand today? Is he still on death row awaiting execution?
As of March 2024, his execution, originally scheduled for May 15th, was postponed.
Okay.
Chief Justice Sharon Kennedy issued the stay until all of his appeals are exhausted.
So the legal battle continues. It's a testament to the principle of due process, ensuring that even those convicted of the most horrific crimes have the opportunity to exhaust all legal avenues.
Precisely. The justice system, for all its imperfections, strives to uphold fairness and accuracy. But even with these legal proceedings ongoing, we can't lose sight of the human cost of this tragedy. The families of Chatisha Sheely, Angela Deskins, and Sherelda Hillen-Terry continue to grieve, to cope with the unimaginable pain of their loss.
It's a reminder that justice, while essential, can never fully heal the wounds left behind by such senseless acts of violence. As we conclude this deep dive into the disturbing world of Michael Madison, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will ponder?
Well, I think it's crucial to remember that while we can examine the factors that contribute to such horrific acts, there's no single explanation for evil. It's often a confluence of individual predispositions, environmental influences, and situational triggers. The challenge is to recognize these warning signs, to intervene early, and to break these cycles of violence before they escalate to such devastating ends.
Yet you've hit on a crucial point. It's not about excusing behavior or simplifying complex issues, but about understanding the forces at play, the interplay of nature and nurture, the ripple effects of trauma, and the urgent need for prevention and intervention.
Absolutely. And perhaps by delving into these dark corners of human behavior, by confronting the uncomfortable realities of violence and its devastating consequences, we can begin to create a world where such tragedies become less frequent, less devastating, and ultimately a distant memory.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this challenging but important journey. We encourage you to continue exploring these complex issues with a critical and compassionate lens. And as you reflect on this case, we leave you with this thought. Could there be deeper societal factors beyond individual psychology that contributed to Michael Madison's path? What systemic issues might have failed him and his victims? And what could we do, collectively, to build a world where every individual has the opportunity to reach their full potential, free from the shadow of violence and despair?
These are questions worth pondering, questions that demand our attention, our empathy, and our collective action. Because ultimately, creating a safer and more just world requires us to move beyond judgment and towards understanding, compassion, and a shared commitment to breaking the cycles of violence that plague our communities.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking understanding. My first question: